Welcome to the Trainer's Bullpen, where trainers in the law enforcement space come to hear experts talk about their work, experience, and research into human performance, particularly as it relates to the critical aspects of training motor learning, adaptive decision-making, and professional resilience. The purpose of the Trainer's Bullpen is to help bridge the gap between law enforcement training and the findings of academic research and current pedagogical best practice. Our desire at the Trainer's Bullpen is to help advance law enforcement training, make research applied, and improve officer and public safety. The Trainer's Bullpen is a production of Raptor Protection, and I'm Chris Butler, your host. And today it's my pleasure to welcome to the show Dr. Mariana Kaiseler. Dr. Kaiseler is a senior lecturer in psychology at Manchester Metropolitan University Institute of Sport. Mariana has over 15 years of experience in research, teaching, and consultancy in psychology of performance and well-being. Mariana's teaching and applied work are informed by her research in coping with adversity and well-being across performance and health contexts. She has published over 30 peer-reviewed papers, presented findings in international scientific events, and is an advisor for funding bodies in the field of mental health and performance psychology. Mariana has an inclusive and multicultural approach to research, teaching, and practice gained through her lived experience in Europe, the UK, and the USA. Dr. Kaiseler, welcome to the Trainer's Bullpen.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. So you're calling in today from near Manchester in the UK, and I appreciate you. We worked through these time differences to make these interviews possible, but I'm grateful that you've done that and for your time, because we're going to be talking to you today about the role of stress in law enforcement and the impact of stress and how we understand that. Specifically, we're going to be interested to find out how trainers should understand stressors on officers in the academy setting and in-service officers, and also how we can maybe put some mechanisms in place and some strategies to help our officers build better coping mechanisms to manage those stressors that they encounter. So for our listeners, we're going to be using as a foundation for this discussion two papers that Dr. Kaiseler was involved in with her and her colleagues, published. The first paper is called Ambulatory Assessment of Psychophysiological Stress Among Police Officers, a Proof of Concept Study. And this paper was published in the Journal of Occupational Health Science. And the second paper is called Transitioning from Recruit to Officer, an investigation of how stress appraisal and coping influence work engagement, which was published in the International Journal of Selection and Assessment. And just as a reminder for all our listeners, if you go over to the Trainer's Bullpen website, you'll be able to download copies of those papers, and we encourage you to do that and read those papers in conjunction with this interview. So, Dr. Kaiseler, let's start with a little bit about you, because I'm always fascinated to get to talk to researchers to find out, how did you get involved in studying in the law enforcement realm? And in this particular case, obviously, your area of expertise in stress. And how did you get involved in the law enforcement domain?
Yeah, so basically my journey, I've done a PhD in looking at stress and coping in elite performance, so around athletes mainly, but within performance outcomes. So within that work, we look particularly at how gender differences, if gender differences influences stress and coping in that environment, and also looked at personality differences. So how someone's differences in personality might influence the way they appraise stress or experience stress and the way they cope. And through that journey, after that work, obviously that gave me a good foundation and an infrastructure in terms of understanding stress and coping mechanisms in performance contexts. And I was always interested in high performance contexts, and equally particularly in contexts where there was high stress involved. And no doubt one of those contexts is law enforcement. So if you look at the literature, it just shows that as a profession, it's probably one of the highest stress profession, for different reasons, 24/7 role, front line all the time. So dealing with multiple uncontrollable events. So it's not like most of us that are on a 9 to 5 job where we know what's going to happen on the following day. The organizational structure, the role involved. So there's lots of factors that make the profession quite risky and stressful. Originally, I'm from Portugal, and you know, that was always an interest of mine to kind of work on that level within my country. So I've kind of developed and start analyzing the literature within that area, generated contacts with professors that were at university in that context, doing research for many years already, involved with National Police Force. And we start thinking about a project that I could lead within my area of expertise that would match the needs of the police force over there. And we put this grant to the European Commission in terms of developing a project looking at stress and coping within the National Police Force, and obviously presented to them, assess their needs and what they thought their needs were at that level. And that informed the design of the project that fortunately, you know, was commissioned and was funded by the European Commission. So I moved to Portugal for a couple of years to work on that project and very closely involved within that research. That was really beneficial for me to shift from, you know, a very sport and performance environment in the UK to that setting in Portugal and transfer that knowledge. So that's been really a very useful experience.
Fantastic. And as I was listening to you with that introduction, I remarked that you were very careful to talk about, or you were specific to talk about, two different stressors, and one I think you referred to as organizational stressors, and the other is basically the occupational stressors that officers encounter at calls for service and encounters with the public. So, and I know we're going to talk about the role or the issues with both of those, the call to call stressors, as well as how organizational structures may impact officer stress as well. So maybe this is a great place to start with this idea of stress, because you know, I'm going to be honest here. In my 34 years in law enforcement, I have heard so many different interpretations, definitions of stress by agency administrators, by mental health professionals talking about stress. And I've struggled to sort of reconcile, like, how do we know? Because my understanding is we have good stress and bad stress, eustress and de-stress. There's chronic stress and acute stress. And when does one that might be positive and helpful become negative and whatever? So can you start maybe just by unpacking, like, what is stress and how do we understand all that?
Yeah, that makes sense. I think most of when I do some teaching with my students in this area, so one thing that we always think about, and I like to get them to think about, is this definition of stress. And basically all of my work is informed by Lazarus and Folkman's stress transactional model. So it's this idea that stress is this transaction between the individual and the environment, the conditions, the experiences that we bring. And I think the best definition that I can think about and that I provide to my students is stress. When you ask someone what stress, or try to define it, is asking the person, what do you think stress is? Because obviously, if you go back, and that's what we've done within the project, and in terms of defining stress, is asking officers on the field what is stress for them. Because someone who is in the front line and actually has to engage, you know, in going into a neighborhood with very specific conditions by surprise in one day, what stress for them might be very different for another office that is backstage and dealing with admin on a day-to-day basis. And that sort of context, and it's really important. And that's, we always work on the premises of the needs of the individual. So understanding what stress for them and defining it that way is the most important thing. Obviously, from a literature perspective and more scientific perspective, then what tends to happen is when that stress, the intensity of that stressor, as we call it, and the amount and the duration of it over time might lead to what we see some health conditions. So if that's high in terms of intensity and the individual struggling to cope, so it exceeds their resources to cope, in the long term, that's when we see things getting, you know, the clinical problems coming in, and the clinical diagnosis of more serious mental health problems that we tend to see in the literature coming on. So it is the intensity and the duration, in simple terms, of the stress.
Oh,
And you're absolutely right. Sorry to interrupt, but on the positive side of stress, because that's really important. And stress is not always a bad thing. What we call the eustress, or something that's positive for us, that actually makes us feel ready to perform, to be at our best. And even for officers, that's really important, to make them feel that their mind and body are at that stage that will help them perform and feel confidence to actually go there and do the best they can do. That's a different sort of training that we're looking on. So that's more the sort of performance stress, or stress under pressure that we look at. And we know that people appraising stresses in a more positive way will help them to perform better, have a better physiological responses that will help them to make better decisions, for example, while on duty. So that sort of thing, which is more narrow and more specific, if you want. Whereas the stress that the project involved and that we're looking on was more the sort of looking at stresses to more psychosocial level, if you want. So what are stresses for officers, and what were the coping strategies that they were doing on a day-to-day life, and how could we help them to be more effective at that level to avoid future health, physical and mental health problems in the long term.
okay, great. So question popped into my mind in relation to that then. So if we could just talk about like that eustress, or that positive stress, for a minute. And you mentioned that if officers, so if an officer under that acute stress of a situation that they have to deal with, but like a potentially violent encounter or something like that, where do they go from having that stressor be a positive for their performance to having it be a negative? Because is this where we tie in this idea and I'm just trying to connect dots here,
Yeah,
because
good question.
I've been reading a lot lately about challenge versus threat states. So
Yes.
is that where we go
Yes,
from
yeah,
good to
yes,
bad?
yes, exactly that. So it is this sort of milliseconds that our brain's got this analysis capacity that kind of assesses that situation, what we call the appraisal of that situation. And we kind of assess the situation that we have in front of us, and also the resources that we have to cope with that situation. And when that matches, or when the individual perceives that you do have the resources to cope with that situation, what we tend to see is a much more effective subsequent action to that, in terms of coping and in terms of performance as well. So that's the positive, or the ideal outcome of that situation. Where the challenges come from is when that mismatch is not positive. So when the individual perceives that the resources of that situation is actually more that they have, or is something really drastic happen in that moment, and they lost that sense of control over that situation. And this is where the choking and the pressure, or that decision making, is not going to be as sharp as we probably expect.
So
Answer?
so go ahead. Sorry, I cut you off.
Yeah, I was just going to ask if that answer your question, where you were coming from.
Yeah, no, absolutely it did. And I think that reinforces for our trainers listening is the importance then of the training environment. So the design and the delivery of law enforcement training, whether that's academy or in service, I think the more that we can use a representative design approach from what they are likely to experience in the
Yeah.
real world, and expose them to that in training, would that help them build those quick assessment appraisal capabilities to be able to deal more effectively with those stressors?
Yeah, absolutely that. So the more we can replicate those scenarios in terms of stimulus, dangerous psychophysiological responses, so the individual kind of appraises that environment, very similar to to real world situation. And we've seen that the literature is quite advanced, and the resources at this level. So you've got, for example, virtual reality nowadays that can stimulate different senses to replicate these scenarios, so officers can be trained within that environment and become much more resilient to actually perform in real world. So that's the extent, and that's the advances that we've been seeing in this area for so long, that actually makes people more equipped at coping in real world situations.
Okay, great. So All right, let's go back to your idea of more the psychosocial aspect of stress now. And so how is stress measured? You mentioned earlier in when you and I were talking prior to starting the interview about, a self-assessment that they're like I can give my own appraisal of how whether or not I feel stressed or I'm sure, you tell us about, how does that work? But is there, other than self-appraisal, is there also like physiological measurements that are taken along with that?
Yeah, so absolutely. So that can be the person self-report appraisal, as through questionnaires, for example, or interviews, or any qualitative methods. But you can also have psychophysiological measures to actually monitor that, so such as heart rate variability, for example. So one of the papers you've mentioned, we've worked very closely with biomedical engineers that have got this T-shirt where they've got ECGs on to monitor cardiovascular waves. So we were able, through that data, to understand a little bit what was the impact of certain types of stresses on the officers in real world conditions. And we kind of trial, there's lots of challenges with that. I'm not going to bother you with methodology, but those of you that are more interested in methodology, is how you synchronize that data and then make what happened basically in the heart from the heart responses. How do you know how the person appraised that from a psychological perspective? And that's a little bit of the challenging of that work. So we've done some studies trying to do that, and then doing interviews afterward to understand what's going on in those moments. But that's a challenge. But from a positive perspective, there's always pros and cons in these things. It also gives us an accurate understanding of what's the impact of certain stresses in someone's health from a cardiovascular response. And that's the work in that angle in the paper. One thing that's important to mention, though, and that's, I think, that our work kind of just added strength to that narrative, is that within officers, and we see quite a lot of mental health, it's a high stressful situation, we tend to believe prematurely that operational stress tends to be more important, or operational stress being responses to the environment, shooting, car chasing, all those sorts of things. But actually, the literature indicates that the organizational stresses tend to be something. I'm not talking about intensity of stress, cardiovascular response. I'm talking about mental health issues and clinically diagnosed conditions. So in the long term, the stress of the profession, the organizational stresses seems to play a stronger role. And I think this is something that we need to consider if we're worried about and we want to improve the well-being of officers in the field. That is not only by changing individual responses to stress that we're going to solve the problem, but actually we need organizational involvement and interventions at that level as well, that change things and make it a little bit fostering higher feelings of well-being, and that officers can look better after themselves. And that would help, with all the other things that we're talking about in terms of stress responses and day-to-day performance. So I think that's important to mention as well.
Yeah, thank you. And I do want to talk to you more about that as we go along, because I think that is so important in my experience as an expert witness. I've been doing expert witness work for over 20 years now, involved as an expert in 33 officer involved shootings. And, Doctor, one of the things that I consistently hear from officers who have been in officer involved shootings, the officer involved shooting lasted 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 15 seconds, that acute event, and it began and it was over. But then immediately after that, they are then embedded into a 2 year to 3 year long in a process that, and so what I hear from officers is that in the response, the organizational response and the investigation was what was debilitating, and what was extremely more stressful was that whole organizational
Yeah,
response.
layer. Yeah,
Yes, exactly. It wasn't the officer involved shooting event.
yeah.
They feel very often very little effects of stress from that,
Yeah.
but
And that's really what we've been seeing in the literature and, systematic reviews, which pretty much analyze all the studies in a certain area. We see coming out not only from the literature from the States, which is, where the vast majority of this research comes from, but equally from Europe and Australia as well. So it's not about the operational stress, but it's more of the organizational culture and the organizational aspects that actually add stress. And exactly, you've provided a very good example out there. It's exactly that. It's the administrative burden on top, and that differs from country to country. The challenges that police officers will face in Portugal will be very different from a particular state in the US. But what we tend to see is that layer of complexity in terms of organizational dealing with things and admin that brings added stress to their role. And that's easily solved if we understand what that is and what practice can be put in place from a management and leadership perspective within those organizations.
Perfect. Good. Well, I'll be excited to hear some more thoughts about what those might actually be, some strategic approaches that agency administrators, mental health professionals, and law enforcement trainers can take to help with that. So I'd like to ask you a little bit about your study, the ambulatory assessment of psychophysiological stress among police officers. So you kind of introduced that. You had officers, they were wearing this T-shirt that was recording the cardiovascular, are you talking about heart rate variability? What were those measuring?
Yes, so the biomedical engineers that dealt with that data, they've analyzed the heart rate variability data that looks particularly how our system reacts to stress and adapts to stress. And based on their intelligence and their analysis, we've tried to do the interviews or the self-report measures to kind of see what they were seeing in those data points. What was that from the officer's perspective? What kind of events have they experienced, and map those events? But it's also it's a very innovative study and methodology, and I think there's room for improvement in terms of the methodology itself. There's always going to be a delay, because if you think on the police role within on duty, and while they are away doing that job, although you can have those systems in place to understand a little bit more about the individual and cardiovascular responses, you always need the individual appraisal on things. And that's really important, just to offer that perspective in terms of what that data means and how stressful it was for that individual.
Okay, so now why is heart rate variability a helpful measure of that stress effect?
Well, you got me into the nitty-gritty. So this is more, to be honest, it's not my area, it's beyond my area of expertise. It's more related with psychophysiology responses, but it tends to be quite a robust. So that's why those the colleagues from biomedical engineer look at that data a little bit. But in simple terms, is a response of our nervous system to stress. So we can see through that data how the system is activated and what are the mechanisms to actually control that response from the autonomic nervous system. So that data allow us to see clearly how the individual reacts and what mechanisms are coming into place to regulate those responses. So it's very idiosyncratic, meaning individualized to each person, and very sharp. But on itself, it doesn't tell us, we just know that something happened. That might be trigger from different stimulus in the environment. Might be trigger from, I don't know, someone's response to an event or a thought or anything else. So we need that self-report data. And that's where the challenge lies, is to understand, in the lab conditions, it's great because you can understand exactly how the individual operates, what's in there. But in these ecological settings, such as, police work, it's a little bit more challenging. So also it is a step in the right direction. And as we've done it, because we also were able to map geographical information. So we knew when that activation occurs, in which location it is in the city, which is, it kind of, no surprisingly, areas that were more risky, those are related with high psychophysiological responses. And then, we're able to, at the end of the day, speak with the officers and understand a little bit more what happened there. We also done that work, with other professions, such as bus drivers in a city. And it just gives us that intelligence in terms of psychophysiological response and mapping those with different geographical areas that can be useful for managers, for example, and police officers knowing what's going on with police in the field from a health perspective. So if someone has got a very chronic acute response from a psychophysiological perspective and needs support, that's quite visible straight away. So it's all that sort of intelligence and complexity that we were able to map with that sort of research in that area.
Okay. And yeah, it seems to me this was a very novel study because, I mean, ambulatory in the title of your paper, but really what you're doing is you're putting this technology on frontline police officers, and they're going out and doing their police work in the field. And then you were extracting the data from that and then comparing that data with officer self-assessments of
Exactly.
their stress.
Yeah.
So that's amazing. I wondered as I read through that paper, do you ever experience where an officer may self-report and say, no, that wasn't stressful. I don't feel stressed. But then when you look at the physiological data, do you ever go, oh, well, actually, but this is telling us that was really impactful on your health in a negative way. Is there a disparity sometime between that?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And that's a little bit of the challenges of that type of research, because it's not accurate to the millisecond. So we have to rely a lot in terms of what's the officer's, what we call memory retrieval in that particular event. So at the end of the day, what were they telling us that happened? We try to take them through the journey, for example, and geographically, so they can facilitate their retrieval and their memory, but there's always challenges associated with that. So we also try to do trial that, and colleagues in Portugal have been continuing that work with firefighters as well. So that's a really interesting piece of research to kind of understand using phones, for example, and putting some data on the phones. But there's some challenge with that in terms of the role, the duties of the role, and it's quite, what's the best word, labor intensive for the individual to actually provide that information on the spot. So if we don't get it on the spot, then the likelihood is that we miss it later on the day when we go and report or self-report measures. So there's that mismatch between what the cardiovascular data suggests and what the self-report data suggests to that amount of detail.
Okay. And so a follow-up to that then, is it possible that an officer may actually be very negatively physically affected? Like there may be cardiovascular effects and all these negative things happening, but from a psychological response, like if I feel, hey, I feel fine, I don't, psychologically, I feel good. Can there be a disparity? Like, can there still be some very concerning negative health effects taking place, even though psychologically an officer reports that they're A-okay?
Yeah, good question. The good thing on working with this team of biomedical engineers is obviously their algorithms are quite refined from a cardiovascular perspective. They do tons of work in terms of cardiovascular measures, how that compares with other normative data sets. So they were able, if there is something in there, and that's the ethical part of the study as well. So when we look at that data and there were some concerns regarding health issues, we would go and follow that up with individuals if that was needed. I don't particularly recall having that, what you mentioned there in terms of a big mismatch. If there was something, it was more probably caused by a physical sort of health problem rather than an event that actually the individual didn't recall. But that said, from a mental health perspective and in terms of disclosure, that's an area I think that it's worth mentioning. Police officers are a very particular population to conduct research in this area on, just because of, don't get me wrong, it's always a sensitive topic for everyone to talk about stress, but it's particularly sensitive among this population. And that is because of the, several factors, one of them being in terms of the role that they play in society, in terms of they're considered safety of society. They're here to protect us all. So to get a police officer to actually talk about their mental health and what they find stressful in their role, it's challenging. And that is, it's something that probably in terms of research methodology, again, we're going to go into that a little bit, probably get more out of of that conversation, if you have a safe environment and actually an interview where you actually understand what's going on in this context provided, and there's that trust relationship, then you get through methods like this one, so the ones that are in that paper. So I think it's different aims for different purposes. So also that method was really interesting from a cardiovascular perspective and health diagnostic. From a stress perspective, particularly around psychosocial stress, there's not much probably that to be added from that sort of methodology. Whereas, for example, interviews or more other methods, more qualitative methods, where you build trust with individuals to kind of understand more their needs and their realities. But that said, and just to summarize, it is a very difficult population to, it does, as anyone, it does need trust building. And that's why it's so important that psychologists build these relationships, that managers build these relationships with staff within their communities. And we've got safe and supportive networks that actually can talk about these topics, because they're difficult.
Yes, absolutely they are. So let's talk a little bit about the results of your ambulatory study with the officers who went out, they did their field work, you came back, you took the data off, looked at the data, you did the self-assessment. So what were the results? Like, what were you expecting to find? And then what did you find as a result?
So no surprisingly, in that study, it was more around operational stress. And that's, a big part of that is because of the type of methodology I was just alluding. It's a methodology that's very prompt someone who's in the field, the nature of those police, the police that participating, their roles, how they were working in the field. So that's more of we were able, if you want, to quantify the amount of stress that those operational stresses created. But as I said, in the big sphere of themes, we know that, also that study was quite innovative and useful from that perspective. It kind of raised awareness for the importance of physical health and mental health. The big sphere of things, it further factors beyond the individual's levels of stress needs to be considered if we've got, the purpose to reduce stress among organizations.
Okay, so when you looked at that, were there particular types of events? So when you compared, you collated to the geolocation, the GPS data, and the types of events, did you look at, was there any themes on types of calls for service or types of events that resulted in higher levels of stressors or not, or what was the relationship?
Yeah, so things like with less amount of control, no surprisingly, were the ones that were causing increased intensity of stress, such as being called into a neighborhood, for example, and having to intervene in that context. Those were the events that were, according to the literature and what we provided on the stress definition, that would bring them higher stress response and higher intensities of stress.
Okay, all right. So I'm just thinking of implications from that alone then, is if we knew as an agency what types of events that our officers go to that will result in those higher levels of stressors, then maybe that should be an indicator to us as there should be some of the strategic exposure during the academy setting, during training, so we prepare them for those higher stress events. Would you agree or disagree with that?
No, absolutely. That's a very fair reflection of it. And I think also based not only on these two studies, but other studies we've done, for example, with the daily diaries, we can find out that having a social support network was quite important for these police officers. However, the ones that were involved in that study, they didn't feel that their support network was very strong. So not having those connections in sport, this is back to that idea that I was speaking before about having stress is a balance between demands and resources. And when there's that mismatch between the demands that I'm being asked and the resources I have, that's when I tend to experience higher stress. So from a prevention perspective, it's important that training academies provide, also think about what resources they can control beforehand that's going to make officers feel more safe, and that they've got important resources to cope. And that's not only resources in terms of, cars or infrastructure. It's also resource in terms of human resources around them. So social support networks, having a community or a team where people can talk and support each other. And when that's not there, and based on the research that we've done in a different paper, we've seen that that's a problem, and they don't feel like, you know, they're coping effectively with that situation.
And if they don't have those social supports, or they perceive they don't have those organizational social supports, do you see that's when coping goes into, like, they have actually harmful, negative type of coping
Yes, more
responses?
ineffective, exactly that. So that more ineffective sorts of coping, and we cope the coping effectiveness is always a tricky angle to look at, because what is coping effectiveness, and what we always try, you can look at the situation, how someone cope, and reflect back and see whether that was effective or not. That's one way of doing it, but we always try to ask that question to individuals, because ultimately they're the ones that will have to cope again. So if they know what worked or didn't work in that situation, they're more likely to, you know, and be in a better position first to evaluate themselves, and then in the future they'll be more likely to use those coping resources or not, because they appraise it as effective or ineffective. So in that study that I was talking about, the one with the diary studies, we asked them what they perceive were their coping effectiveness, and they found that social support also, they thought that was useful, because they didn't found they have that a lot. They felt like they didn't cope effectively with that situation. And that's something, you know, that can be built in terms of academy training and support networks that kind of make those boundaries stronger, that can equip individual more with those resources.
Okay, so what type of social supports have you found officers are reporting to be most helpful to them? Like, is it from within the organization, or maybe even outside the organization? Like, because I think there's social supports in both of those, right? In an individual's
Yes,
personal life, in their family life, in their religious life, spiritual life, whatever that is,
yes.
but then also organizationally inside. So can you tell us, like, specifically what type of supports are most meaningful for officers?
Yeah, so in this particular study I'm talking about, it's a study that looked at daily stress and coping among officers that were going, you know, into the front, into the front line, as we call it, into intervention. And they've used diaries for 11 days, and there were 14 officers involved. They used diaries for 11 days, and they were able to see what stresses they face and how they were coping with those stresses, and how effective they thought those strategies were. So also, they were using more social support, so they were reaching out to these networks, and they were trying to get to talk to people. They found that was not very effective. That makes us think, from a researcher perspective, those networks are not giving them what they feel they need. And sometimes, you know, a manager might be sitting in their office and thinking that officers have got all the support they need because they've got a team, they've got, you know, administrators in the office. But if those relationships are not there, if they don't perceive to have that support, that's not going to make anything. So you're right, it's about what tangible is, what we call tangible support. So the resources that are visible in place, but then what emotional support are they receiving for the needs that they have in that particular moment in time. And with these officers and in this study, we envisaged that was very much related with relationships within the team. So it's when you go out of a scenario like that, where you're feeling quite distressed and you need to debrief with someone, who can you trust in your team to have that conversation? And that's probably wasn't there so the individuals felt that they probably couldn't open, or, you know, they didn't feel trust enough. And it might be for different reasons, because the team might be new, it might be, you know, there's so many factors that can affect that. So we're not judging from that perspective. We're just thinking from a prevention and actually making things better, is building those relationships to a stage where individuals know what to do after an event like that, when they're back in their cars and back, you know, to the station, what sort of conversations they need to have, and feeling supported in that environment. That's essential.
Okay, and to what degree do you think agency culture might play a role in sort of dampening or discouraging a member from reaching out to those social supports? Like, even if they know they're there, and I'm just speaking from my own personal law enforcement experience with my agency. I saw this many times where it was sort of like this culture where, well, we deal with it, just kind of,
Yeah.
be just go do your job, and we don't
Get
talk
over.
about this,
Yeah.
we don't deal with it. And so do you think culture historically has sort of damaged or impaired an officer's ability to want to reach out, even if they want to, they feel they're not going to because of that?
Yeah. That's a very good point. There's a very good study conducted in the UK that actually talks a little bit about this in terms of um, relationships and about mental health, particularly within police officers. And it's really interesting. And the topic being, how much do you disclose? Do you disclose what are the challenges that you face within that environment? And it provides through qualitative data some of these testimonies that actually just show the complexity of having these conversations. And, officers talking that they prefer not to do it because they're talking with their manager. They don't know what the implications that's going to
Mm.
have. Is the manager going to speak to human resources? What's going to happen with that information afterwards? They feel ashamed of their feelings, and because the profession is so tough in terms of what you're regard to do, disclosing that to someone and how you're going to be perceived within that environment brings huge challenges, and it's complex. So and I think that paper just brings all that evidence and just showcases what's going on behind the scenes. And in our paper as well, what we've seen with the diaries is that there's also resources which are physical. And those are resources such as investment, from funds in terms of the police that goes into cars, into better resources, things that are very tangible to get. And that were some of the things that officers felt that they were missing, and that brings added stress as well. So we're talking about resources from a different perspective, so tangible resources, emotional resources, and psychological resources, and also creating this safe environment. And I think nowadays, that since we've got so much attention going on in terms of diversity, equality, and inclusion, that's a main topic of our attention that should be dedicated to forces. Because obviously, as human beings, we tend to be more inclined to relate and to speak with people that are similar to us, to a certain degree of affinity. So how is that represented in police forces? So how we having those, do we have, and I'm not only talking about the representation of that diversity in terms of gender, ethnicity, all the cultural aspects. I'm also talking about seeing those people in leadership and senior roles, so others can think, actually, they've made it there. I can reach that role. And that's really important to include, to reflect about inclusive and diverse practices within police force training.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you for that. And you mentioned earlier too the word trust, and I think you mentioned it several times. And so, I'm wondering here for example, law enforcement trainers who have, if they've got an academy class that they have for 4 months or 6 months in the academy, is I do you think that the importance of that trainer, like, yes, you have to train them in all these skills and all that stuff, and absolutely that's our fundamental role, is to prepare them physically to be able to manage those events. But I wonder if trainers should also view a primary purpose of their role is to build that trust relationship with the men and women who they're training in the academy, to talk to them about stress, about the impact of stress, maybe even tell personal stories, share that vulnerability, to kind of try to break down this cultural barrier. And yeah, do you think that if an officer, they go through an academy and they had a trainer like that who was vulnerable, who talked to them about it, who genuinely cared about them, then they're out on the street maybe months or even years later,
Yeah.
they might call that trainer and say, "Hey, look, I'm struggling here. I remembered you shared that with me, or you were very vulnerable and honest with the class back in the academy." Do you think that trust may be an important connection for that?
Absolutely. And I think that's super powerful because it just shows, at the end of the day, we're all humans. And that person that's sharing that story, is sharing their real life story. They've got more experience. This show, they're normalizing this set of feelings that we all do. We all got good days, we all got bad days. You know, on the bad days, it's tough to go back there and go through the same situations. And I think sharing that vulnerability is just going to strengthen that normality into things. And when people feel that way, they feel like they have that space, and it's okay to feel that way. And that will sort of encourage others within teams to do the same thing. But what we have to have be real in here, this is an environment where, you know, historically people, military sort of education is quite tough. And to have those sorts of conversations, to have that sort of environment, but it's not impossible to change. And I think, you know, that the testimony that you've just mentioned there is quite powerful. And I'll definitely encourage people to at least to reflect more about on the power of that based on their own experiences and how they treat others. Because there's another layer in here that we haven't talked about, but it's very important, which is the role of the officer with engaging with the public. And I think that's when that trust is built. And officers, and that's, you know, building on the literature again, that's a huge stressor for them, is that emotional sort of, you know, when you see a very traumatic situation and then you're going to inform the family afterwards. Imagine the challenges of that. There's a huge, you know, you need to be in a very healthy and sanity to actually control your emotions and go and show empathy with somebody else. So in terms of emotion regulation, it's huge. It needs to be really something that we look at in terms of supporting officers in doing the job, which is so difficult that they have to do, and have the sort of state of mind and emotion regulation to actually regulate themselves and support others, because that's what their job is about, is being there for the community, is supporting the community. And that's when we see in some cases, you know, those interactions that are not very good, they're probably already a sign of the burnout that officer is in. And because he's in that state where he's not able to actually control himself and pay attention to their own needs, that's their response to the community that hasn't been very good. But that actually, that in every day, in long duration, can build that distrust in terms of the public and that relationship as well. So I think that's what managers need to consider and see this wider picture, that it's not only creating mental health in the individuals, is actually looking after the well-being of society as a whole, because we all need, in particular looking at the mental health crisis that we're all in, I think creating these environments that are safer and normalize feelings a little bit more, it's really important.
Absolutely. Well, that's extremely helpful. Can you talk maybe in the little bit of time we have left about, are there specific, so I understand the psychosocial supports, the importance of that, the importance of changing culture, the importance of trust between your peers and your supervisors and all that. What about is there techniques or tools that we can train officers to use that have been shown to actually be helpful at maintaining mental health? Because I guess maybe this is a different part of the conversation, because we're talking about the negative effects of stress and how to reach out for help when you need it. But should we also not be interested in maintaining mental health and
Absolutely.
resilience as part of
Yeah.
an actual strategic, like, don't just go on with your life and your policing career day after day and week after week and not look after your mental health? Like, do you not need to be intentional about strategies for optimizing your mental health constantly?
Yeah, no, thanks for bringing that up. That's really useful. And I don't think I've mentioned that enough in my responses. So I'm also a registered psychologist, and I do work, you know, in the applied field a lot in consultancy. And my response for that is that it is also, no doubt, is a huge need. So self-care, and everyone should hugely be encouraged to understand what works for them. Understand how they feel and manage their, as a priority element, manage your own self-care on a day-to-day basis. And we're talking about, you know, things like sleep, basic health essentials, eat healthy, relationships, you know, community. As for us all as human beings, we should be the main main priority for us all. But back to your question in terms of what can people do, I think that's a very personal sort of experience. And I think we all should try to start reflecting more about what works for us as individuals. So what are the things personally, I've done a lot of research, and I apply mindfulness principles in my work quite a lot, self-compassion principles. And that said, with the athletes that I've worked and people that I've worked in my career, it's not going to be a one size fits all, and that type of work's not going to fit for everyone. So what we tend to do in sessions is understand a little bit more what other person needs, what makes them click, basically, in terms of the controlling their emotions and regulating themselves. And, that might take weeks in terms of training and understanding, but I think it's a very useful work that individuals should do in terms of learning more about themselves. How can they have their restorative practices, in day-to-day life, for example, after work? What makes them feel that they are restoring those mechanisms to actually allow them to decompress and be there on the following day with the same energy and the same state of mind, the best state of mind that they can have. So that's really important. So in summary, it's different layers of influence, I suppose. It's the individual, the one we've just mentioned around what the individual can do in that process. I think there's what the organization can do in that process to work with individuals and facilitate that environment as well. And note-taking, it's the government, at the government level, how much funds can be put into the profession to actually an investment can be provided, because the more that's done, the more resources will be created in terms of physical resources, human resources, psychological resources that can make these individuals that are essential in our society. And just to finalize with a reflection that we know there's a lot more. We are in challenging times, and there's much more to come. Climate change, we've got lots of world challenges, life expectancy increasing, comorbidities in terms of health. There's so much that society is going through. So we need police officers to be at their best. We want to support them in being at their best, and we need governments to invest those funds in their health and well-being.
Absolutely. Well, that's very helpful. And I appreciate your comment about the individuality of every officer needs to find, what works for them, what is healthy strategies for being able to find those tools or techniques to be able to maintain that mental health and that resilience. Are there specific resources that you would recommend? So if an officer is listening to this right now and they're going, you know what, I actually feel I need to do better at that. Maybe I'm having, there's indicators that I'm having stress injuries or the negative effects of stress. Where would you direct them to go? Like, where could they find to start to explore what some of those helpful strategies might be?
So in terms of clinical support, and if you feel, it depends on what people think or where they are, but definitely check in with yourself, see how you're feeling, how long, those things are going on, see what support you've got within your organizations that you work. And, I'm not going to provide suggestions, because I think that's very different within countries. For example, in the UK, where I live, there's charities around that are quite well positioned to support police officers and their families. So it might be search for those resources within your own countries, or there's always, if you've got the resources from a financial perspective, private individuals that can help you in that journey. And there's so much things that are free nowadays, like applications such as, I don't know, without putting any marketing on things, but applications that you can download in terms of mindfulness practice, and see if that works for you. More important, trial it. Trial and use a diary, for example, simple journal every day where you monitor your thoughts, the way you're feeling, how you're relating to yourself. Try to keep that, spend that and put that investment in trying to know yourself and your own development, because that's the best investment you could do in your life, for your own good and for the good of others. That will be my advice.
Awesome. Thank you. Dr. Kaiseler, we're going to wrap up the interview, but I want to give you the last word. Is there anything that you would like to say to agency administrators, mental health professionals that work with law enforcement agencies, just to close off the interview, words of advice or encouragement for them?
I think it's a thank you for all the hard work that they do. I think this continue to do the work that you do. I think it's really important that we share our practice. Here in Europe, we try to do that. So we've got small networks that going on, but if we can make those networks bigger, you know, get in touch with myself and others, and let's try to do the best job we can do in supporting officers and supporting each other in that role.
Fantastic. Thank you. And on that note, if anybody would like to reach out to you to talk to you more about this issue, what's the best way for them to connect with you, Doctor?
So I am on LinkedIn, so probably just direct message me and we can take it from there. Thank you very much, and pleasure to be in here. Let me just finish, and thank you very much for your interest and for the time and space. It's been really pleasant to discuss this.
Yes, absolutely. Well, and thank you. Thank you more importantly as well for the work that you do and continue to do to help advance mental health in first responder populations is a critically important topic. And as you've already mentioned, we have much more work to do to make the necessary advancements in that. And we need to lean on experts and researchers like yourself to give us that guidance to do that. So thank you. We've been speaking with Dr. Mariana Kaiseler, Senior Lecturer in Psychology at Manchester Metropolitan University Institute of Sport. Thank you so much, Doctor, and we look forward to having you back on the Trainer's Bullpen again.
My pleasure. Thank you.